Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in the series of MarshWatch for 2025. I can't believe it's 2025 already. Before we get started, I would just like to let you know that I am joining you today from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. I call Saskatoon home, and I absolutely love it here. A little bit of an agenda for this evening. We're going to talk about what is MarshWatch and what you can expect from the program. We'll also segue into the wonder of wetlands. I figure, you can't have a program like this without telling you about what wetlands are, how they came to be, and why they're so neat and important. And then I'm going to share some contact info, and we can afterwards go ahead and have a discussion, have some chat. That portion of the webinar won't be posted online, so that you only get that if you're able to tune in. And then there's going to be a post-webinar questionnaire that lets me know where you're tuning in from, how many people were watching with you, and if you tuned in before. This just helps us to keep track of where our audience is and all of that good stuff. So let me introduce myself. My name is Leanne Latremoy, and you can say Latremoy if you're French. Both of those are fine. I say Latremoy for the English folks because it is a lot easier. I also go by Bird Lady, and in several small towns in Saskatchewan, I am known as the Bird Lady. But what you might not know is that I have been running around doing wetland surveys, mucking about in those habitats for quite some time at this point. My first field job in this field was, in 2008 in Southern Ontario. I was, brand spanking new outside of a technical diploma and got hired to count birds. So my background, I've got a technical diploma in wildlife biology. I also went to McGill and did an undergraduate in wildlife biology, but otherwise I've been working in the environmental field, and almost all of that time has been with Birds Canada. Birds Canada is a not-for-profit organization. You may have heard of us before if you're tuning in. We've got a mission to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats in Canada. So this is just me in a variety of wetland places. It's kind of my happy place. I really, really love getting into a wetland. I love the smells. I love the sights. They're such neat places, and they're full of life. And hopefully throughout the series, you'll gain an appreciation and maybe be a little bit enthusiastic about wetlands as well. Okay, so what the heck is MarshWatch anyway? So it's an introductory program, but it doesn't need to be. I know there's been lots of experienced bird watchers who, have told me they've gotten a lot out of this program as well. So, you can use it to hone your skills no matter where you're at in your bird learning journey. We're going to be covering birds and amphibians by sight and sound. And we're also going to do, a bit of wetland appreciation mixed in there. And we're also going to do a little bit of plant ID because it's really helpful to be able to point out and say, those cattails over there, and know the difference between the cattails over there and the bulrushes on the other side. So we'll do a little bit of plant stuff. We won't focus too heavily on it. There's going to be 10 weekly webinars. As you know, they're going to be recorded and posted online. There's also going to be some quizzes during the webinars where we do bird ID, and I also have some that are posted online on the MarshWatch website, and those ones are visual and audio. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to do an audio quiz in webinar, so we won't be able to do an audio quiz in webinar. I also do some guided walks in the kind of spring and summer time, so kind of this maybe June through July time. We're going to be doing them in select locations in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but I'm also open to requests in the prairie region. So if you're, say, from Swift Current and you have a whole bunch of people would be interested, let me know and we'll try to make something like that happen. And if you're into, collecting data and submitting things to citizen science, we also would welcome you to submit a checklist from a wetland of your choosing, absolutely anywhere. If you want one specifically to go to, you can always ask me, but we would like people to collect checklists in June and July. Okay, that is the little bit about what MarshWatch is. The schedule, we're going to be running 10 weeks, March 5th through May 7th, and we'll cover all kinds of bird ID. We'll have a few review sessions, and the very last one, we're going to really focus on listening to soundscapes and do a little bit of program wrap up. The ID sessions will have 6 to 8 species of birds. We're going to be covering about 50 species in total. We'll also cover, as well as their ID by sight and sound, habitat preferences, and just cool facts. Birds are really neat. We'll also cover a couple of amphibians, about 8 frog and toad species, and we'll cover those by sight and sound as well. Occasional plants tossed in, reviews, and discussions. And you don't need to memorize this list, but that just gives you an appreciation of what's to come. We're going to be covering a whole lot of species, but at a, I think, pretty reasonable and slow pace. And hopefully that slow pace will help you to, put some of that to memory. And, if not, you can always go review the material online anytime you want or attend again, because I know there are people who are tuning in here for the third season in a row. Welcome to those of you who are returning. And of course, there's going to be a cancellation plan in place. I suffer from migraines and I don't always get to pick when those happen. Most of the time I don't. So if I know I'm going to have to cancel a webinar, I'm going to send out an email to everyone who's registered as soon as I possibly can. And we'll just have a standing reschedule date and time. And those will be scheduled to the Friday at 7 p.m. Saskatchewan time. Now, that brings me to my slight gaffe. I probably should have started this a week from now because I forget that the rest of Canada changes their time. We in Saskatchewan no longer change our clocks. We haven't for some time. It's wonderful, highly recommended. But as of next week, for everyone else, the timing of the webinar is going to be, an hour later for you, unless you're in Alberta and BC. Anyway, you guys will change the time. Ours will remain the same. So I will try to send out an email next week with the correct times for every, area in Canada. So that way you can have a better idea of when you're going to be tuning in. So sorry about that. I probably should have just done it a week later, and that way there would have been no changing of any of the times. So my apologies. Okay, here's a small place. Here's a small sample of what some of the slides are going to look like for every week. Like I said, we're going to be covering a set amount of species. So here's an example of one of the earlier ones. And, the species pages, they're going to be pretty in-depth. I've spent a lot of years at this point kind of developing the slides and trying to find the best photos that really highlight, the species and the aspects that I want you to focus on, such as the green-winged teal. And, one of the best things you can focus on, especially ducks at any sort of distance, is try to remember where the white is on the body. White reflects all of the visible light, whereas the darker colors and every other color is going to absorb some amount of those light waves, but white is going to be reflecting them all back at you, which means that even in low light conditions, the white is really going to stand out. If you were looking at this green-winged teal drake, at a distance, and it's just getting that kind of dusky twilight, you'll find that all of the colors become muted and hard to tell apart, and they lose their contrast, but the white still really stands out quite brightly. So something like that, those little tricks, I'm going to be sharing all of these with you that I have kind of developed for myself and learned from others over the years. So you get lots of tips and tricks, lots of lovely, neat photos. We're going to talk about, both the males and the females of each species. If they look different, some species they don't, but especially ducks. The female ducks can be tricky. And we'll also talk about their diet, kind of a bit of their behavior. We'll be covering their sound. Here's an example of what green-winged teal drakes sound like. Those cute little peeping noises. So we'll be covering all kinds of sounds, which is one of my favorite aspects about birding. That's when you feel like a magician or like you have a superpower, because you can be standing somewhere and you can have your eyes completely closed and you can start naming species, left and right once you're starting to learn them. And it takes time and it takes practice. And hopefully with these species, it's a select group that we're going to be trying to pay attention and listen to. I'm hoping that you'll be able to grasp some of them, by the end of it. And if you don't, you can always come back and do this again. This sort of, learning takes a lot of practice and a lot of time. So hopefully we'll get you to be, remembering some of these for the long term. And we throw in plenty of comparisons. So here's an example of the drakes with a dramatic eyeshadow. So both of these species have that really lovely iridescent green eyeshadow that kind of goes from the eye to the back of the head, but we're highlighting differences in between the two to try to tell them apart. So lots of comparisons, and you'll be happy to know, lots of hen comparisons because those female brown ducks can be really tricky to tell apart sometimes. So I'm going to be giving you lots of good tips and tricks like that. So I hope you enjoy them. They've taken me, about 15 years to accumulate in my head, and that's the best thing about going out and birding with someone is learning their tips and tricks for things. And this is all of the stuff that I've kind of accumulated over the years and can hopefully share somewhat coherently with the rest of you. Sometimes, when you, especially with bird sounds, if you're trying to describe it, what it sounds like to me may be completely different from what it sounds like to you, but just try to pick up whatever, makes the most sense for you and whatever works with your brain, because all of our brains work differently. Okay, so those are the examples of what those slides are going to look like, and it's a lot of fun. There's some really nice, pretty bird and amphibian pictures. So hopefully you're stoked for next week when we really start to dive in and get into those, tips and tricks and different species. But of course, where would we be without telling you about why wetlands are as neat as they are? I think wetlands are just they're so fascinating for so many reasons. But let's talk about what exactly is a wetland. What we're looking at on the screen right now, it's not quite a lake, right? It's not quite a pond either. It's definitely not dry ground. You're not going to want to walk around in your sneakers, if they're nice sneakers anyway. So a wetland is defined as land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes as indicated by poorly drained soils, vegetation, and other biological activity adapted to a wet environment. And this comes directly from the National Wetlands Working Group. So that's kind of the technical definition of what a wetland is. A little bit easier to digest, you might be thinking about a wetland as it's a dynamic transition habitat from water and dry land. And, a wetland like this is actually going to be dry come summertime. There's not a lot of wetness there. There's not a lot of water on the landscape. So again, poorly drained soils and supporting those wetland plants. You're not going to really see these plants outside of a wet context. They're really an in-between kind of transitional environment between a lake, fully water system, to dry land. Wetlands on the prairies are classified basically based on water permanence because you may have heard the prairies have been in quite a bit of a drought for the last couple of years, and the prairies in North America go through these long cyclic drought and deluge periods, and we are hopefully, fingers crossed, we are coming to the end of the dry period, and it always takes, some time to get back to that state of lots of water on the landscape because the water table has drawn down fairly low. So it's going to take a few years of a fair bit of water on the landscape so that it looks like it's a wet place again. But that was kind of recognized, and in 1971, Stewart and Cantrud published the classification of natural ponds and lakes in the glaciated prairie region. And to give you a bit more of a functional look, this slide's from Ducks Unlimited in the Manitoba Wetland Classification Guide, and essentially they're classified based on water permanence. How many years on average is a place saturated with water? Some of them are only ephemerally saturated with water, some of them are temporal, some of them are seasonal wetlands that may be wet in the spring and then dry up come summer. Some of them are semi-permanent, like some of those deeper marshes where you'll often get cattails and bulrushes. Those are containing water in most years, but say I think it's like one out of every 5 years they dry down completely. And the permanent wetlands are those that are almost wet, they're wet year round and they're wet in almost every year. And it's only kind of 1 out of every 10 on average where that basin won't have water. So it's just a way of classifying wetlands based on their water permanence. And you can sort of see some of that because the different vegetation has, affinities to varying levels of water. Some plants can tolerate having they need their roots completely submerged to, take hold and thrive. And some of them really just want a little bit of moisture. Some of them want seasonal moisture. So here's an example of a nice field with some horses in it, and an example of a class 2 wetland with some of those rushes making the vegetation look really, really dark. There's like they're round little plants. They're really very cute. And then in that kind of transition between that class two and the upland area, you get that class one where it's just a little bit moist sometimes in the spring. Here's another example, class five. This is going to be mostly open the whole season round. There's going to be water in it. It's only going to be very rarely that there's not going to be any water in it. And we'll see those class four wetlands that have a mix of open water and cattails and bulrushes off to the side. This is a recently flooded basin. This was near Margot, Saskatchewan. And it was very, very wet out there for a few years, and actually had the pleasure of surveying there for 4 seasons. And that it dries up as the season goes on, and over time it gets less and less wet. And so this is a recently flooded basin, and it will be mostly dry come summer. There was only a little bit of water in the spring. And even the really, really large basins can periodically dry up. And this is part of the natural process. It actually helps to keep, wetland plants healthy and in check because, you can't have unlimited growth. You need some of them to die out, make room for some of the new ones. Likewise, with the flooding, you'll kind of, if it overflows its basins, you'll notice that a lot of the shrubs and trees will die, and those will make more way for more wetland plants. And it is a natural part of the cycle. They're really dynamic and interesting places because over time, especially like I said, out here on the prairies where we go through these long and periodic drought and deluge cycles, it can be quite a dramatic change. And those of you who've been on the prairies the last 5 years have known that it has been, kind of exceptionally dry in a lot of places. And so here's 2021 Neely Lake. This is kind of in the boreal fringe. And I was just amazed at how receded you could tell this wetland basin was. And I'm sure in a couple of years, when we get back into that swing of more precipitation, that wetland basin is going to fill up, and that that change in between having lots of vegetation and some of those drought and deluge where it makes holes in the system, whereas otherwise you might have an entire mat of happy cattails, which works for a lot of species, but there's a lot of others that really like bits of open water and open areas. So this drought and deluge helps to make things a little bit more patchy and heterogeneous. And if you're like me, you can go play on Google Earth, or I think Google Maps might have a time slider, but definitely Google Earth. If you want to download that and play around, you can actually see those drought and deluge cycles on the landscape. So here's a satellite view near Prudhomme, Saskatchewan in 2002, where it was pretty dry. And then 10 years later in the same place, 2012, we were quite in the middle of a fairly wet period there. All of those basins that looked dry, you can focus on the one right in the middle of the screen. I'll flip back to the dry one. You can see the edges of that basin, and some of those basins will get cropped right through in the dry years. Some of them get left alone, but all that to say is that the landscape can really change a fair bit between those drought and deluge cycles. Now you might be wondering, why are there so many wetlands on the prairies anyway? Those of you in other locations, you might be going like, that is an awful lot of water on the landscape. And you're right. And it's kind of incredible. And I don't know that, folks who've grown up here their whole lives, if you really have an appreciation for that, because the rest of North America is not quite like this. There really is a beautiful and unique type of landscape. All of these little disconnected basins all over the place that bring so much life to the prairies. So what might have caused this? Well, if you guessed the Ice Age, you'd be correct. More specifically, it has to do with the meltdown of the last Ice Age. And this movie poster, or this movie image, is really perfect because it really highlights how these potholes got here. So our little friends are standing on chunks of ice that have broken off from the main glacier, and that really is what causes all of these little wetland basins to form. So about thousand years ago, this was the maximum of the glacial extent. This was the biggest that the glaciers reached, covering almost the entirety of Canada. There's a couple of little places, on the west coast that were spared and act as little refugia, but the rest of the landscape was under several kilometers of really thick ice. And if you've ever had the pleasure of seeing a glacier, you'll know that it's not just this pristine white snow. Glaciers really are kind of like a bulldozer as they're growing and moving across the landscape, and they really accumulate all kinds of rocks and soil, and they're scraping against bedrock, and so all kinds of stuff, you know, mostly, rock material gets incorporated into them. So when the glaciers finally started retreating, they don't do so in a neat, orderly fashion. Sometimes they advanced, sometimes they retreated, and as they retreated, occasionally there was going to be there's ice blocks that got left behind. So I'll blow that piece up right there. So imagine as it's retreating, and you can take a look outside these days right now because I'm sure a lot of Canada is in a kind of melty state right now. All of the melt is really happening on that dirty snow, all that snow that has like that road gunk and rocks and things. It melts a lot faster than that pristine white stuff. So you can imagine a big glacier is going to have varying amounts of that, and so it's not going to melt all nice and evenly. And very often a lot of big chunks of ice just kind of got broken off, and sediment and other depositional materials like rocks and boulders and things settled around them, so that when the glaciers, were finally gone, on the continent anyway, um, they left behind these little kettle lakes or these little pothole lakes. And these pothole lakes, pothole wetlands, they can be, really, really small in size, or they can be, almost like as large as a very large lake. Um, I took in a webinar about a week ago with a geologist, and Old Wives Lake, if you're familiar with that in Saskatchewan, is apparently a kettle lake. So it would have been formed by a really huge chunk of ice that got kind of orphaned and stayed a chunk of ice for longer than the surroundings around it. So this is why we have all of these little potholes all over the landscapes, because all of those chunks of ice got left behind, and all of those little lumps and sandbars and things, all of those are, depositional materials from the retreating glaciers. So kind of fascinating. Geology really, really informs, how the landscape is in the current present day. And I always love thinking about things on a geologic timescale because we really have no frame of reference for how long something was ago. 10, 18,000 years is a long time ago. Um, so this whole region here is what's called the prairie pothole region, and not the entirety of it is covered in all of those wetlands, but in general, there are a lot more of those pothole wetlands than there's, I would say, in the rest of Montana. As you can see, the Canadian prairies accounts for a good chunk of this prairie pothole region. And if you're from elsewhere, I highly recommend that you come and pay the prairies a visit. It's really, really beautiful. And if you drive around, you'll just be amazed at the variety and size of different wetlands that are just on the landscape. And this region really is North America's duck factory, because in wet years, when it's at its maximum, when there's the most, you know, water on the landscape, the basins are all full. In those years, it can account for 70% or more of the continental waterfowl population production. That's an amazing amount of waterfowl production that happens right here. And in part, that is because of that little mix of these small disconnected basins that oftentimes are fishless. So there's nothing to, worry about in terms of your young getting eaten, and there can be plenty of food in them too. So really, really critical landscape for waterfowl production. And, it's beautiful. So if you happen to be flying around and visiting the prairies, like do come and take a look. It is quite unique. So we've touched a little bit on why wetlands are important, but giving you the broader view, wetlands absorb floodwater, they recharge groundwater, they sequester carbon, and they purify it, acting essentially like a sponge. All of that vegetation that, dies every season, it falls into the wetland and it doesn't completely degrade, and it makes this really incredibly porous soil, and it has a lot of capacity to hold more water than, say, a straight mineral soil would. It's really, really heavily um, carbon material, all kinds of dead plants and things. And so they're just incredible. They can expand and they can contract and hold an awful lot of water. They prevent shoreline erosion. So all of those wetlands, if there's a stream coming through and it goes into a wetlandy area, it's going to slow down the speed of the water, which is going to prevent erosion. Same thing on lakes and ponds. All of that wind action, if you get little waves lapping at a beach, you're going to have shoreline erosion. So all of those natural plants and things that can occur on the edges of small ponds and lakes and rivers and things, those really do help to keep those shorelines intact. And of course, they provide food and essential habitat for a variety of animals: fish, shellfish, water birds, land birds, mammals, all kinds of critters. And of course, also they provide a ton of food and resources for human, everything from wild rice, cranberries, fish, game, and plant roots. Okay, we've also learned to mimic some of these, and in some places, like this awesome diagram of the wetland wastewater treatment system in Walnut Cove in North Carolina, they actually, use all of those principles of wetlands and all of the things that go into helping to purify water, and they will do it for drinking water systems. Of course, there's an additional step usually at the end to make extra sure, but there's a lot of systems that really take advantage of the natural wonder of wetlands for making water, purified and safer to consume. Okay, habitat for wildlife. Of course, we're going to talk about all kinds of birds, and there's all kinds of species that, directly nest in, on, or almost directly adjacent to those wetland areas. And here's a whole bunch of examples of species that are literally nesting inside of the wetland. Ducks, especially those dabbling ducks that nest maybe a little bit farther away. They're going to be nesting in an upland area, a little bit of a, grassy knoll. They will take their broods right down to the water, and they are critical for rearing ducklings. And these places are great because there's less predators that can get at them. And there is all kinds of food in there. And especially if it's a small wetland that doesn't have any fish, there's no competition for all of those little critters and plants and things. Like the ducks can go to town on them, and it's really, really cute to watch little ducklings, toddling along and getting to a wetland with mom and chowing down on all kinds of food. To give you an idea for just how much food there can be, I took this photo along the fishing lakes in southern Saskatchewan near Foam Lake, and there can just be massive, massive amounts of food. So these are all scuds, Gammarus lacustris, and these are really, really excellent food for, of course, fish, but also all kinds of birds that are going to be eating aquatic insects and invertebrates. So they make really, really fantastic little food factories. Of course, there's all of the other critters that go and use them, sometimes temporarily, sometimes they live there. So leopard frogs are going to be hanging out there for most of their life cycle. Some of them visit parts of those wetlands for, drinking water and food sources and all that good stuff. So there's a ton of little critters that are just, you know, in and around the wetlands. They can be really critical areas for refueling for Arctic nesting shorebirds. Here's a variety of them. And, these birds may only stay a really short time, but the food that they eat is actually really, really critical for them to continue their migratory journey and to hopefully end up in their nesting grounds in really good conditions to go ahead and start laying eggs. So especially incubating adults, they're going to be on their eggs most of the time, and they're going to be really heavily dependent on the fat reserves that they've built up. So these little feeding areas, these shallow wetlands, they're super, super important to, even birds that you might not see very much. You're only going to see these birds for a short time in the spring and fall migrations. And some of them, you'll see them in the spring migration, and then they'll take another route in the fall. But, you know, just because you don't see them there for very long doesn't mean that they're not absolutely critical for their life cycles, and they really are for a lot of species. Fish, of course, are obviously, aquatic species, but things like northern pike, they breed specifically in wetland shallows. The One of the colloquial names for them out here on the prairies is slough shark, and a slough is a wetland. And the shark just kind of gives you an idea for how much of a fight they like to put up when you're fishing. But the name kind of incorporates that wetland aspect to them, and they will often lay their eggs in places that will dry up by summer. So they scatter them, the eggs attach to the shallow vegetation, and then the little guys can hatch, and they'll hang out in that kind of really shallow area where they're safe from other fish, because big fish eat the little ones, and they pike will consume smaller pike. So they really want to hide out and try to get big in those shallow areas where the big fish can't get to them. So wetlands are critically important as well for waterfowl species. Taking off from the wetland, there's often these really, really big clouds of midges. If you've ever driven by in the summer a wetland and you just see this dark cloud hanging above it, those are midges, and those are really important food source for things like tree swallows and purple martins that are avian aerial insectivores. These guys really are highly dependent on flying insects, and so much of the bulk of production of flying insects is going to be happening in a wetland environment. You get these really massive pulses of insects that get out and they fly, and they try to they try to survive and finish their reproductive cycle, but they are absolutely sought after by all kinds of swallows. Other birds that you might not think would go after something so teeny tiny and so small. Here's a few photos of a mallard duckling and a Franklin's gull hawking insects. So the mallard ducklings are going to be running along and trying to catch those insects. Insects are really important, even if a species mostly eats plants or seeds as they're growing up. When you're little, they need a lot of protein, and so even something like a hummingbird is going to be catching little insects and giving it to its young because they need that protein. They need all those other nutrients. Just like human kids, they can't live on sugar water. It's not good for them. You can't grow if it's just sugar water. So there's all kinds of species that you wouldn't necessarily think are going to be after teeny tiny things that are kind of annoying that hatch from wetlands, but rest assured there's all kinds of things that really depend on some of those flights. And interestingly enough, there's some insect wetland connectivity that happens. So here's some water boatmen, and it was discovered that these little water boatmen, they spend most of the season hanging out in their little tiny disconnected wetland. They breed, they go about their life cycle. Some species in the fall make the journey off into the river system, where they then spend the winter as fish food. There are a lot of fish that become highly, highly dependent on these species in the off season, like in the winter when there's all kinds of ice above all the wetlands and above the rivers. There's a lot of fish that are going after these water boatmen, and they're an incredibly important food source that connects these little disconnected pothole wetlands. And in the spring, there's another big migration of these little critters that goes back into that wetland that then continues the cycle of mating, reproduction, and then going off to become fish food elsewhere. And so just to say that even though some of these basins are small and they can be disconnected from larger systems at first glance, it doesn't mean that they necessarily are. So they're really interesting systems that can be highly connected. However, there's an estimated loss of about 3% per decade of wetlands in the prairie provinces. So if you think wetlands are important, I would encourage you to write your MLAs and ask them about wetland policies, because Saskatchewan doesn't really have any strong wetland conservation policies. Manitoba and Alberta do. We are kind of lacking them here in Saskatchewan. So if you think that's something that's important, I would encourage you to write your MLA and say, hey, wetlands are important. What are we doing to conserve them? I'll get off my soapbox for that, but wetlands are important, and they can be at risk of all kinds of drainage. As the example here, someone has gone in and ditched to get rid of the wetlands on the landscape. Okay, so let me take you now on a short little journey, and I'll give you a taste of what the sounds of the wetlands will be. And if you've taken these webinar series in the past, you'll know that last year I discovered at the very end that maybe annotating little soundscapes was going to be a good learning tool. So I'm going to be incorporating more of those this season, and I would invite you to listen to the very first one that I've got here. I'll talk through the very beginning of it because it's just going to um, play quietly for the first couple of seconds. I'm going to recommend that you bump up your volume as much as you can. I will be posting these to YouTube, and these will be best heard with headphones. Okay, so there's a quick intro to what I'm hoping to make for lots of soundscapes. I only recently got a better program for doing this in, so I don't know how many I'll have the time to make for this season, but I really enjoy making them, and hopefully this is going to be a resource where you can, go check them out and listen to them. I think probably one of the better things to do is as we go through all of these series is, eventually you should go to YouTube and listen and maybe just pick one of the species. So say that one, LeConte sparrow was really close and I had the bigger music notes for it. So you could go through and just practice hearing that species, because it's one thing to hear one bird song or one bird call in isolation. The tricky thing is when you go out somewhere and all of a sudden you've got a wall of noise to try to hear through, and it's possible to do. I like to liken it to learning another language, in your native tongue. Let's say it's English, you could be in a party in a room full of people, and, you could be catching snippets of a conversation that's happening in the next group over. You're not necessarily trying to listen, but because you recognize the sounds enough, you can make out what they're saying. But if you were, say, trying to learn French and you're, don't have a great big vocabulary and you need things to be, a little bit more explicit and slower, if you were to go into a similar situation where you had a room with people that were all speaking in French, maybe you're going to have an okay time trying to hear the person that's around you, but you're not going to be picking up all of those snippets of conversation elsewhere because your ear is just not as well tuned into it yet. And so as you get more familiar with bird calls, it is really like learning a language, and you can start to pick up a little bit more of the subtleties. And if you pick up a snippet of a call, then you start to be able to recognize it, like, oh, I should maybe listen to that. I think I'm hearing a song sparrow. So things like that, and that just takes practice. So hopefully those little wetland video soundscapes, where I've got the timing, I don't know how well it it showed up over Zoom, because I know there's a little bit of a time lag between the audio and the video of Zoom, but they should be a little bit higher quality when I get them up onto YouTube. So we'll be trying to practice some of those things throughout, and that's a new aspect that I'm really excited for. I think they're going to be a really good learning tool. So that's all I have for this evening. It's a little bit of a short one, and next week we're going to start diving right into, we'll do a brief birding 101, and then we'll dive into the species for that week. And I am so excited to, share all of that with you. I really enjoy this program. I have a ton of fun doing it, and yeah, I hope you do too. You can reach out to me at any time. My email address is llatrimoy@birdscanada.org. I know that's a lot to try to spell. Um, you can also find my contact information on the Birds Canada webpage. You can always just Google MarshWatch and Birds Canada, and the web pages will come up. You can visit Birds Canada on the website and all the different socials. I'd like to say a big thank you to MarshWatch supporters. That's the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Ministry the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and Wildlife Habitat Canada for making this programming possible. And to you guys, I don't get to have a program if nobody shows up for it. So thank you very much. If you enjoy this kind of work and you're able to make donations, consider Birds Canada in your giving portfolio. We are not for profit, so all of those donations really do help us continue to do this work. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now because I'm sure this file is going to be very large, and then I'm going to go through some of the questions because I see one has come through on the Q&A.